So I didn't want to have to do a video on this matter, and I'm reluctant to do the video I'm about to do anyways, but there's a video that came out on MSNBC that, well, was pretty over the top. The title of the video is MSNBC's Ari Melber destroys the NRA's lies about the AR-15 and the Second Amendment. I thought it was pretty heinous, so, I guess I'll do a video on it. I've seen the first 15 seconds or so of it, so this is going to be largely a review on the fly. So, be interesting to see how this goes.
America's having the gun debate again. This is the debate over who gets access to guns and what type of guns. The Second Amendment does not apply to AR-15s.
Actually, the Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, the word arms means arms, so it not only does it include the AR-15, it includes a huge variety of other items that would be considered arms that aren't guns. So when I believe it was Madison gave the okay for private merchants to, I believe it was Madison responded to inquiries from the private sector about carrying cannons on private merchant ships. He said something along the lines of, "Yeah, of course you can. Why wouldn't you?" And in fact, during the Revolutionary War, the U.S. Navy was, well, not really a navy. In fact, the vast majority of combat ships at the time were merchant ships that had already been equipped with cannons. And one of Washington's first major acts as general of the armies was to ensure that any of the powder that they captured and any of the cannons that they captured went to these merchant ships so that they could defend themselves against the tyranny of their own government. These were cannons. Cannons. So we're talking cannonballs, not 22 rounds. The AR-15 shoots a 223 round. I was 11 when I first shot a 22. I was in Boy Scouts when I first shot a 22. It was encouraged in Boy Scouts to learn how to properly use a firearm, especially the 22. So no, this is not. This is absolutely covered by the Second Amendment. But we'll go on. Now, in fact, actually, you know what? I'll stop there. In the Federalist Papers, I believe it was 8 and 22. Publius, who was the alias for Hamilton and Madison, and I forget who the third person was, who wrote the Federalist Papers, specifically said, we need a well-regulated militia, not a military governed by the government, but a militia, which is to constitute every human being who is capable of carrying a gun within our borders. And implicit in what those documents said, not in what I just said, but in those documents, was the fact that it applied to any gun. Further, those founding fathers that wrote the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. Constitution, the Federalist Papers, they were in office for decades after the signing of the U.S. Constitution. Yet, and in that time, there were huge innovations in firearms technologies. The repeating rifle became a far more common tool, even though it was still not very common, but was absolutely commonly available, and everybody knew about it who was in power to make laws restricting it. Yet, none of this was changed. Back then, they could have easily rescinded, retracted, or written about the Second Amendment and what their intentions were and why it should not apply to these new technologies, and didn't. And this isn't because of negligence. They're our founding fathers. They were not negligent on these type of matters. We'll go forward.
It does not apply to assault-style weapons.
What is an assault-style weapon? We need a clear definition of terms. If it is an assault-style weapon that the military would define as an assault-style weapon, we're talking automatic rifles. Fully automatic rifles. They're already illegal. Well, not entirely illegal, but basically. So this is kind of a weak argument, to say the least. And assault style, if we're referring to anything that stylistically resembles an assault weapon or an automatic rifle, that doesn't make it any different from... those are stylistic changes. Those are cosmetic changes. Those are aesthetic changes. I don't see how that change in form affects its function. The whole form over function argument. Again, we'll keep going.
It never has.
It always has.
Congress may legally ban those weapons.
No, they may not. The Second Amendment says, in clear English, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The fact that they didn't even specify who shall not infringe it means that no government should be infringing that right. That the right is inherent. It's a natural right. It is right. It's a God-given right. And that no one is to infringe you from that right. No one is to interfere with your right to keep and bear arms.
Without touching the Second Amendment. That's a legal fact.
No.
But it's hard for many politicians to defend AR-15s.
It was really easy for me to defend the AR-15. And politicians have been making this argument for decades. So I don't know why it's so hard for many politicians to defend the AR-15s.
It's hard to explain why, as a policy trade-off, it's more important to make it easy to buy AR-15s. And
it already isn't easy to buy AR-15s, by the way. If you've never purchased any rifle before, purchase a rifle. Purchase any rifle, let alone an AR-15. It's not easy to buy. You do have to go through a background check. You do have to. There is a 3-day hold. It's a federal 3-day hold. So that's not true at all.
To restrict their use as weapons of mass murder.
Again, okay, this is a little tiny bit. So this is a huge error in argumentation here. To restrict their use as mass murder weapons. Well, what we're saying then is we're restricting their use as mass murder weapons. So we're totally okay with you using the rifle to do basically anything other than kill people with it. Yeah, we already have a law in the books about that. It's called murder. Homicide. We don't allow homicide. We don't allow manslaughter. There's rules against this. We don't need any further rules against manslaughter and homicide. They're very clear. People who commit these crimes are... It's the only... Homicide is the only crime that you are allowed outside of... is the only crime that you will face in a criminal court in the U.S. that faces capital punishment. So not only do we have laws in the books, not only do we have enforcement of those laws in the books, you have the highest standard of enforcement. We can kill you. The government can kill you if you kill somebody with these weapons, which is justified. So, in fact, the people that are largely making these arguments to make it illegal to buy the AR-15 are the ones that are usually not in favor of capital punishment, and are the ones that are in favor of more lax enforcement, which means in favor of more lax laws regarding using a rifle for mass murder. So there's a contradiction of terms here at least. And I think the point that he's missing is that it's being we are all in favor of not allowing somebody to use, not restricting, forbidding someone to use any weapon, including the AR-15, to kill a whole bunch of people, especially innocent people. So I'm not sure what his point here is. If he's attempting to make a rational point.
So politicians talk more about the Second Amendment than these weapons.
Because the Second Amendment applies to these weapons, but more importantly, to all weapons.
I tried raising this with Texas Republican Congressman Michael Burgess on the show just last week, but instead of talking about guns, about AR-15s, he kept returning to the Second Amendment.
Because it precludes you from making restrictions on the ownership or the freedom or the right to keep and bear arms. That should be the end of the discussion. Should we ban X rifle? Well, is it an arm? Do you have a right to keep it and to bear it? Done.
Well, there is a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, and if that discussion then is to a particular type of weapon, so be it.
The Supreme Court has never ruled the Second Amendment protects AR-15s or...
Okay, so it has never ruled that it protects AR-15s because there has never been a ruling on whether or not it protects specifically AR-15s. However, in the Heller case, in D.C. versus Heller, they determined that the Second Amendment does give you the right to keep and bear arms. In fact, the dissenters of that opinion, their argument was, the dissent in that case was that no private citizen has the right to own any firearm at all, a full repeal of the Second Amendment. So, not only it's a false argument. There is certainly it's at least a very, 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 very weak argument, if not a logical fallacy outright. In fact, let's rewind this and hear this.
Second Amendment protects AR-15s. Rule the Second Amendment protects AR-15s.
Okay, and the opposite of that is that it never ruled that it hasn't. So this is a case where we have to, if you're making that argument, which by the way is an argument from authority to begin with, you either have the right to have the AR-15 or you don't. Whether or not somebody says you do has nothing to do with whether or not you have that right.
Or any individual right to weapons of war. The Supreme Court has repeatedly rejected, even hearing cases, trying to get Second Amendment protections for those kind of guns. In fact,
so the cases that it lists are Colby versus Hogan in 2017, New York State Rifle and Pistol versus Cuomo in 2016, Friedman versus City of Highland Park in 2015. The reason they rejected these cases, the reason they didn't even want to hear them, was because they were open and shut cases that were essentially referential to stare decisis on Heller, which means that the cases that were coming before them, the arguments were going to be either you have the right to bear arms or you don't, and they already decided on this. So the reason they've rejected this isn't because they're saying guns are bad. They've rejected this because they've already decided on this matter, and it is that you have a right to keep and bear arms.
It did so 3 times in the past 3 years. The Second Amendment does protect handguns.
It does protect handguns. Why would it protect handguns and not rifles? So if you actually take the barrel of in this case, let's say, an AR-15, if you take that barrel and basically get rid of it, and in fact get rid of the entire gun and turn it into just the receiver, that's a handgun. Take a look at it. It's basically missing a firing arm and a short barrel, and that's a handgun.
The Supreme Court precedent.
In fact,
it does not protect these AR-15s.
how?
Every serious expert on the law and the Second Amendment already knows that. So as this...
No. In fact, the majority in Heller, D.C. Heller, disagree with you.
This debate goes on. If someone tells you we have to live with these weapons because of the Second Amendment, either they don't know what they're talking about, or they think you don't.
No, I think you don't know what you're talking about.